are living in obedience to God. So because people will say, well, you can be an unbeliever and have a successful marriage, and they're wrong, but it's because they don't know the definition of a successful marriage. The success of a thing is defined by its objective. We have to define the objective of marriage to say that you succeeded in marriage. What was God's intent behind marriage? What are you supposed to accomplish when you get married? And that is in the book of Malachi when he says, he was in essence telling the Jews that the reason for which he instituted marriage is that he wanted a godly seed. Malachi chapter 3. In other words, the objective of marriage is for those two parents who are living in that household to raise children after the image of God. The objective of marriage is producing godly seed. The objective of marriage is producing godly children. What does it mean to be godly? It means to be godlike. So the objective of marriage is to produce children who are like God. Any person who does not accomplish that has a failed marriage. It's not just divorce. It's not just infidelity. No. A successful marriage is a marriage that produces godly children. See, it is just that those two people staying together, obviously, well, then if they get divorced, it's not a marriage anymore. And then, of course, if the two people aren't happy, that doesn't help in creating the kind of environment that produces godly children, because there are the fruits of the Spirit. One of them is joy. And so, and a child will become what they see. If there's no joy in the household, they won't reflect that virtue. The child will only become what they imitate. The Bible says, be ye therefore imitators of your Father. Jesus says, I only do that which I see my Father do. And so if the atmosphere of that household doesn't capture joy, the child will not have a joyful life, which will, of course, stifle the two parents in producing a godlike child, because that's one of the virtues of God. But besides that, what I'm saying is that an unbeliever cannot have a successful marriage by definition, because an unbeliever cannot produce godly children, because you can only reproduce after yourself. You cannot take a seed out of a watermelon and produce an apple. The Bible says, who can bring the clean out of the unclean? You cannot take an ungodly person and produce a godly child. No. He says that which is born of the flesh is flesh, that which is born of the spirit is spirit. It's the law of reproduction. Everything reproduces after itself. The disciple will become like his master. You can't, do you understand? So only a godly man can produce godly children. Only a godly woman can produce godly children. You will reproduce after yourself. And so it is impossible for an infidel, an unbeliever, a non-Christian to produce godly children. It is also impossible for even a carnal Christian to produce godly children. Because when you are a carnal Christian, remember what it means to be carnal. It means to be a slave of the flesh. And the flesh is the desire within mankind to disobey God. So if a believer is living in disobedience to God, they're not living like God, because God's laws come from his nature. If God says don't lie, it's because he doesn't lie. So when you're obeying his instructions, you're mirroring him. See, because if he instructs you to do X, it's because he does X. If he says don't do X, it's because he doesn't do X. So every instruction of God comes from his nature. And so when we're obeying God's instructions, we're functioning like God. And so if a person is not obeying God's instructions, that means they're not living like God. And if they're not living like God, they cannot produce children who are like God, because children are poor listeners, but they're good imitators. They'll only reflect what they see in the household. If they don't see God-like living, they won't live godly, because they're sure as heck not going to find it in the world. You see, they're not going to go out in the world and find godliness. They must find it in the household. But I'm just saying all this to say we have to first define a successful marriage. I'm not saying that's the only component of a successful marriage. Of course, there's joy. Of course, there's the romantic dimension, the financial dimension. But ultimately, the ultimate telos, the ultimate objective of marriage is producing godly children. Whatever else is accomplished, that not being accomplished is a failed marriage. Even if the two people are happy. If their children are devils, if their children are sons of Belial, unprincipled people, people who are not productive and are not producing anything worthwhile in society, it is a failed marriage. Even if the two people are smiling and the children, it doesn't matter what the conditions of the marriage